Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. In this video we are going to learn about the thalamus, its general appearance, its location, its relations, its connections and its function. So what is thalamus? It's an egg-shaped mass of the grey matter that is present at the rostral end of the brain, and it functions as an important relay and integrative station for the information which is passing to all areas of the cortex, to the basal ganglia, to the hypothalamus and to the brainstem. And it forms a major part of the diencephalon. And what is diencephalon? Diencephalon is basically a part of the brain which consists of the third ventricle and its boundaries. Central nervous system is divided into two major components which include the brain and the spinal cord. The brain is also called the encephalon and encephalon, further divided into the three major parts: the telencephalon, the diencephalon and the brainstem. Now telencephalon and diencephalon together form the cerebrum, and telencephalon is the outer core of the cerebrum, whereas the diencephalon is an inner core which consists of the third ventricle and its boundaries. Now brainstem consists of the mesencephalon, which is the midbrain, the pons and the medulla. In this diagram you can see that diencephalon is formed by the third ventricle and the structures that form its boundaries. Now third ventricle is present between the two thalami. It means that the medial surface of each thalamus is related to the lateral surface of the ventricle, which is the third ventricle. Posteriorly, the two thalami are related to the pineal body and with the habenular nucleus, which together form a structure which is called the epithalamus. Then inferior to the thalamus, as the name implies, inferior to the thalamus will be subthalamus, and then inferior to the subthalamus there will be the tegmentum of the midbrain. Now let's see the ends of the thalamus, the surfaces of the thalamus and the structures that are related to these surfaces. First of all, thalamus has two ends, the anterior end and the posterior end. The anterior end is rounded and it forms the posterior boundary of the interventricular foramen, and the posterior end is expanded to form the pulvinar. Now pulvinar is the free end of the thalamus. Here you can see this is the free end of the thalamus, which is not related to the pineal body and to the habenular nucleus. The relations of the surfaces of the thalamus. So superior surface is related to the caudate nucleus, then to the lateral ventricle and then to the fornix, and inferior surface is related to the subthalamus and the tegmentum of the midbrain, and lateral surface will be first related to the stratum zonale, external laminar nucleus, and then to the internal capsule and lentiform nucleus, and then medially it will be related to the third ventricle, lateral wall of the third ventricle, and antero-inferiorly it will be related to the hypothalamic sulcus and posteriorly to the epithalamus. Here you can see medially there will be the third ventricle and laterally there will be the internal capsule, and here there will be the lentiform nucleus, and anteriorly there will be the interventricular foramen. The coverings and the subdivisions of the thalamus. Thalamus is covered on its superior surface by a layer of white matter that is called the stratum zonale, and on its lateral surface by another layer of white matter that is called the external medullary lamina. Let's see how the thalami are subdivided. So the thalami are subdivided by a mass of white matter which is called the internal medullary lamina, and this internal medullary lamina consists of the nerve fibers that are connected to the various nuclei of the thalamus. This internal medullary lamina also consists of the masses of the grey matter which are called the intralaminar nuclei. This internal medullary lamina splits to form a Y-shaped structure and divides the thalami into the three main parts: anterior part, the medial part and the lateral part. These all three parts contains the specific type of the nuclei. The anterior part contains the anterior thalamic nuclei, the medial part contains the dorsomedial nucleus. The lateral part is further divided into the two parts: the ventral tied nucleus and the dorsal tied nucleus. Right and left thalamus are connected together by a band of the grey matter that is called the interthalamic adhesions. Now we will learn one by one all the thalamic nuclei. First of all, let's see the anterior thalamic nucleus. The anterior thalamic nucleus is mainly responsible for adjusting our mood in response to the recent memories. It is basically responsible for maintaining our emotional tone in response to the recent memories. For example, if we receive a kind of news that can be bad or good, then anterior thalamic nucleus will be responsible for integrating that type of news. For example, it has the relationship with pathways of the recent memory and emotional center. Now let's see which track is basically sending the fibers to the anterior thalamic nucleus. So the fibers from the para-hippocampal area enters the fornix and ends on the hypothalamic mammillary body. This, as the name indicates, this is the mammillothalamic tract. So it means that fibers will first go to the mammillary body, and then from the mammillary body these fibers enter the anterior thalamic nucleus, from where the information enters the cingulate gyrus that is found above the corpus callosum. It means that cingulate gyrus, which is responsible for our emotions and which is controlling our emotional tone, and the para-hippocampal area, which is basically responsible for our recent memories. So these two connections of the mammillothalamic tract proves that this pathway is responsible for controlling our emotional tone in response to our recent memory. Now let's see the medial part of the thalamus. The medial part of the thalamus contains a single nucleus, that is the dorsomedial nucleus, and its function is to adjust our behavior and our psychological and physical state according to our mood. So it has two connections with the prefrontal cortex, because prefrontal cortex is that part of the brain that is responsible for our mood, our behavior and our emotions, etc. So importance of this dorsomedial nucleus is that all the information that comes to the thalamus enters the dorsomedial nucleus. So it has connections with all other intrathalamic nuclei as well as to the substantia nigra and globus pallidus and with hypothalamus also. As we already discussed, the lateral part of the thalamus is divided into the two further parts, which include the dorsal tire and the ventral tire. Now the dorsal tire consists of the three nuclei, which contains the lateral dorsal nucleus, the lateral posterior nucleus and the pulvinar. Now let's see one by one all the three nuclei of the dorsal tire part. So the lateral dorsal nucleus is actually a displaced grey matter from the anterior thalamic nucleus. So it has the same functions and same connections as the anterior thalamic nucleus. As we already discussed, that anterior thalamic nucleus is mainly concerned with controlling our mood and our emotional tone according to the recent memory. So the lateral dorsal nucleus of in the dorsal tire component has the same functions and the same connection, which is the mammillothalamic tract. Now let's see the lateral posterior nucleus. Lateral posterior nucleus is actually connected with the superior parietal lobule, and the pulvinar, which is the third nucleus in the dorsal tire component, it is connected with all other intrathalamic nuclei. It is a highly integrated center, and also it has the heavy connections with the lateral and medial geniculate bodies. So we should know what are the lateral and medial geniculate bodies. I will discuss it later. And pulvinar has two-way communication with the visual association area, with the auditory association area, with the somatostatic association area. In the cerebral cortex, there are the many parts which are related to these special senses. For example, in case of the visual senses, there is the primary visual cortex, then there will be the secondary visual cortex, and then there will be the tertiary visual cortex. The secondary plus the tertiary visual cortex will form the visual association cortex, and then same will be in case of the auditory cortex, in which there will be first primary auditory cortex, then secondary auditory cortex and tertiary auditory cortex, and secondary and tertiary will form the auditory association area. It means that this pulvinar is highly integrated center and it is connected with the association area. After discussing the dorsal tire, then come to the ventral tire. Ventral tire consists of the three nuclei, which are the ventral anterior nucleus, the ventral lateral nucleus and the ventral posterior nucleus. You can memorize it by a mnemonic ALP or PAL. It means ventral anterior nucleus, ventral lateral and the ventral posterior nucleus. Ventral anterior and the ventral lateral nuclei are a part of the motor system, whereas the ventral posterior group is basically concerned with the sensory system. And this ventral posterior group is further divided into the three nuclei, which include the ventroposteromedial, ventroposteroinferior and the ventroposterolateral. First discuss the ventral lateral nucleus. Ventral lateral nucleus receives the fibers from the dendrothalamic tract and send its fibers to the supplementary motor area and the primary motor area. As we already said, that ventral lateral nucleus and the ventral anterior nucleus both are concerned with the motor activities as a part of the motor system. So it receives the fibers from the dendrothalamic tract dentate nucleus, which is present in the cerebellum, and send its fibers to the supplementary motor area and the primary motor area. So it is basically concerned with the motor activity. So in case of the ventral anterior nucleus, that is also a part of the motor system, it receives fibers from the reticular formation from the basal ganglia, especially from the pallidothalamic tract, and it sends its fibers to the prefrontal cortex and the premotor area. It has a major role in the motor movement planning. So the ventral posterior nucleus, first of all let's see the ventral posterolateral nucleus. It is a relay station for the sensations such as the pain, temperature, which come by the lateral spinothalamic tract, and the proprioception that come through the medial lemniscal system. And then ventroposteromedial nucleus, it receives the same sensations as the ventroposterolateral, for example touch, pain, temperature and vibration, but in this case it receives these sensations from the head and neck, and it is also connected to the nucleus tractus solitarius for taste sensation, and it receives its fibers from the trigeminothalamic tract that originates from the spinal trigeminal nucleus. Ventroposteroinferior nucleus receives its sensations from the vestibular nuclei, and these senses are related to the balance. See some other nuclei that are related to the thalamus, which include the geniculate bodies, the intralaminar nuclei, the midline nuclei and the reticular nucleus. So the intralaminar nuclei is connected to the reticular formation, and it receives the pain pathways such as the spinothalamic tract, the trigeminothalamic tracts, and most of these fibers come directly, but some are connected to the reticular formation, and it is also connected to the cerebral cortex. Main function of these interlaminar nuclei is that they are responsible for the cerebral arousal, act as the main switch for the cerebral cortex, and they are basically responsible for the level of the consciousness and the alertness in an individual. For example, when the cerebral cortex is too much stimulated, we can't sleep. For example, when there is the pain in any area of the body, signals will constantly go to the reticular formation and to the cerebral cortex. It means the cerebral cortex will be too much aroused and the signals will not be diminished. It means when we need to sleep, there will be some switch which is in the form of the interlaminar nuclei that will basically switch off the cerebral cortex so that we do not receive these type of the senses anymore or receive in the weaker form. In case of the midline nuclei are the group of the nerve cells which are adjacent to third ventricles, and they receive the afferent fibers from the reticular formation. And reticular nucleus is a thin layer of nerve cells which is present between the external medullary lamina and the posterior limb of the internal capsule. Now let's see the medial and lateral geniculate bodies. The medial geniculate body form a part of the auditory pathway, and it is a swelling on the posterior surface of the thalamus beneath the pulvinar. Here you can see this is the medial geniculate body. It is present beneath the pulvinar on the posterior surface of the thalamus, and it is a part of the auditory pathway. Afferent fibers from the medial geniculate body forms the inferior brachium that are connected to the inferior colliculus, and inferior colliculus of the midbrain is basically responsible for receiving the auditory information. The lateral geniculate body form a part of the visual pathway. It consists of the 6 layers of the nerve cells, and it is a swelling on the under surface of the pulvinar of the thalamus. So here you can see under surface of the thalamus there is a swelling which is called the lateral geniculate body. The lateral geniculate body receives the visual information from the opposite field of eye, and the efferent fibers leave the lateral geniculate body to form the visual radiation which pass to the visual cortex of the occipital lobe.